All right, so aim 6.3, what is Buddhism and what are its main beliefs? We just went over responses to the do now, so here we go. All right, origins. I'll give you a minute. Okay, so we said one of the things we're going to try to do is we're always going to try to pay attention to origins, where these things start. So this is built around the life of a guy named Siddhartha Gautama. The basics of this religion are found in a couple of different documents, I guess you want to call them. The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. They're not really documents, more of doctrine, kind of. So these two things, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, kind of really lay out like the basic beliefs of Buddhism. And it starts in India and eventually spreads to China, where today it is most popular. But one of the things we talked about when we did River Valley Civilizations and we did the stations activity for River Valleys, we talked about the Silk Road and how the Silk Road facilitated the spread of Buddhism. You guys saw a couple of different Buddhist statues. And we saw the differences in the statues and so on and so forth. So most Buddhists today can be found in China, although there are spread out kind of all over the place. All right, I will pause for a second. So I think, as is the case with a lot of things, religion is really just philosophy, right? It's just a religious philosophy becomes a religion, right? So one thing you will come to find out is that philosophers base their philosophies on their own lives. Okay, so if this is the philosophy of Siddhartha Gautama, and he starts talking about how life is full of suffering, we can kind of make certain assumptions about what his life was like. Okay, or at the very least, what he experienced in some way, right? So you will come to find out that philosophers are really just a function of the environment that they exist in. Okay, and it's the same here. It's no different. We will go through a little bit of biographical information about Siddhartha, and you will kind of see where his kind of perspective comes from. But he starts with life is full of suffering, and then he goes on to say that suffering comes from desire, which makes sense. I think oftentimes our sources of suffering come from not getting what we want. Now, sometimes that's very easy to understand. I want the brand new Xbox. I don't get it for Christmas. I'm pissed. Like, that's an easy one, right? But, other extreme examples are, when loved ones get sick and pass away, for example. That's suffering that comes from desire there. Your desire is that they weren't sick and dying, right? And then when that desire is not met, that's when you feel the suffering, right? So he goes on to say that you can end this cycle, and you can end this cycle by reaching the Eightfold Path. And essentially what he's saying is that if you want to eliminate suffering, just stop wanting things. If you don't want anything, you will never be disappointed. And I think there's some truth to that, right? But I mean, the flip side to it is that kind of creates a kind of strange life for yourself, right? So if we look at this as kind of a general kind of visual representation of what he's trying to say here, I think our lives are mostly like the graph on the top, where we experience peaks and valleys. And I think this is true for everyone, where there are times of happiness where everything's going really well. And then there's times of sadness and suffering when things are terrible, right? And the only reason we understand the suffering is because there is happiness. It's all in relation to each other. So what Siddhartha is saying here is, some of our greatest sources of happiness come from when we want something and we get it. So the flip side is true. So what he's saying is that eliminate that desire and you will never be sad again. But that turns our lives into graph number 2, where we don't feel those high peaks of happiness. So that's the trade-off. If we want to eliminate the sadness through his philosophy, we also, by default, an unintended consequences, we eliminate the happiness also. So what would you sacrifice all of your happiness in order to be saved from your sadness? Or would you prefer to experience both? So do you want none or do you want both? And that's a trade-off that, I think all of us have to come to terms with at some point in some fashion. But ultimately, that's what he's saying. That the idea that, you can eliminate desire, but when in eliminating desire, you eliminate both sadness, which is his intention, but you also eliminate happiness, which is an unintended consequence of this philosophy, I think. So this is something, something to consider for all of us, where, this is kind of a philosophical system that we would have to come to terms with pretty quickly. I mean, for me, I think I'd probably live life number one, where, you know what I mean, where you experience those highs, and yeah, there are lows, but that's life. You know what I mean? Life number two seems boring. Just, you're never really sad, but you're never really super happy either. So, that's kind of the trade-off.